Hello everyone, this is Chris Jamel at Exiton Interactive, and by the time we are done with this video we will have changed our send screen so that when it animates in and we get a result from the server, we'll have an animation, we'll have the message change, we'll have a message, and the message will animate or change depending on what the server sends back to us. We'll also have an SVG element in here, in this X, that will animate, showing that the user, or showing to the user, in fact, that there was an error, of course, along with the message. And this works in both Firefox, both Chrome and Firefox very well. I will complain about Edge at the end of this video. I will show that there's plenty of examples online, so if you search for, what we're doing is animating the stroke-offset property on our SVG. You can search for that, and there's a ton of articles that talk about how this works, why it works, what we're doing. So I'm not going to reinvent the wheel by going into a long explanation about the whys and hows. You can also find videos on YouTube about doing it as well. So like I said, I don't think there's any reason to reinvent the wheel there. And like I said, that's what we'll have by the time we're done with this video. As usual, you can find a link to the article for this video in the description below. And let's get started. If we go into Visual Studio here, the first thing we're going to do is modify or do a few changes or additions here. If we go into the components folder inside of our authenticator.component.scss file, remember that we created this EM function here, and I want to be able to use that function, at least for right now, in the send screens styling and probably elsewhere. So what we're going to do is to move that to where we can access it. So I'm going to go down to our SAS folder inside the base folder, and I'm going to create a new item and create a SAS file. We're going to call it _functions.scss, of course, and scroll our notes back up to the top here. So let's create a new function inside of here. So function, and I'm going to create it called EM, and we're still going to pass in the pixel, but this time we're also going to pass in the base font size. And I'm going to default it though to 16 pixels. So if you don't pass it in, it'll be default. And let me just copy this in before I make a mistake. So same deal that we were doing for our EM function previously, except again we're passing in the base font size. Let's go back to the authenticator.component.scss file. We'll delete this function. Come up to the top here. We're going to import that file. We can spell. And import. I still can't spell. Import. Okay, so it's in the SAS folder inside the base and functions. So we have that back. And to make our life easier when dealing with the send screen, or fixing it here or designing it, we're going to get rid of this or comment out the overflow hidden. So if we check the browser, we see that our send screen again is now visible. And let me close the style sheet here and the functions. Next thing that I want to do is to go into our sendscreen.component.ts file, and I called this thing container, which is sort of not following the naming convention that I was using in the previous file. So let's just rename this. We're going to take container, rename it to sendscreen DOM, and then of course I'm going to update everywhere container appears. Save that. So now we are ready to begin new stuff here. So I'm going to go into the sendscreen.component.pug file. First thing I want to be able to do is to show a message to the user. So I'm going to create a new div with a CSS class of message, and I'm going to bind its inner HTML property to a property on our class called message. Save that. Go back into our sendscreen.component.ts file, And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a private read-only field called default message. And that default message, let me just copy it. I don't want to. Probably the same amount of time. So 1 moment, please. Your request is being processed. Now we also have to create, or we don't have to, but we are going to create a private field called message. It's going to be a string. Defaults to null. We're going to create a public getter, which just returns the field for the moment. We'll also come down here to our constructor and we'll give it the, tell it the message, the field is going to be equal to this default message. Perfect, save that. Go back to the browser and we see that our message appears up at the top there. So let's go back to Visual Studio, do a little bit of styling. So again, remember we put that .message class on there. And I'm going to use a mix-in include from bourbon called position absolute. So we're going to position absolutely. We aren't going to set the top, but we are going to set the right, bottom, and left. Next, we're going to say text align, and we're going to center. We're going to give it a color of white. And I've forgotten the whole reason we made that function file. Just because I wanted to use it here. Sass base functions. And the reason I want that is I want to say padding, and I don't know, maybe the padding shouldn't be EM, who knows. We'll do it anyway. Padding and font size. And the font size 24 pixels. Save that. Go back to the browser again, and now we can see that our styling is being applied. So that's good. Once more, back to Visual Studio. And let's modify a little bit here. Let's open up the authenticator.component.ts file. And if I go down to the login method, which you can remember is for right now what we're doing. So when they hit send, we're showing the screen, we're animating it in. When we get the response from the server, right now all we're dealing with is failure response from the server or error response. We're just calling the hide method from our send screen, so just hiding it. What I want to do is modify this. I'm actually going to change this to a method that I'm going to call failure. Failure is going to take in a string, which is going to be the message that should be displayed. All right, so for this case, we're going to say unable to log in using the provided username and password. Save that. It's going to complain at me because it hasn't been created. So let's go back to the sendscreen.component.ts file and actually create that. So we'll create public failure. Again, takes in a message, which is a string. All it's going to do for now is to say this.message equals message. And we're also going to, so now we're displaying a failure message. We're going to want to have the send screen animate out. And so to take care of the sort of simulation of the animation, we're going to set a timeout. And that timeout is just going to say this.hide. And we're going to duration of 3000 milliseconds, so 3 seconds. We'll save that. And the next thing I want to do is inside the hide method, say const animation. The reason I want that is because once the animation or once the send screen is hidden, I'm going to go ahead and have the message set back to the default message. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. Go back to the browser, hit send, it comes down, animation changes, it goes back up. You can see though that it has an abrupt change from it to just 1 minute one message and next minute's the next message, and I don't like that abrupt change, so we're going to deal with animating that a little bit. Also, you can see that once it comes back up here, although we're setting the message equal to the default message, it's not updating. And that's because Angular doesn't know we're setting it in the using the timeout. Doesn't know that there needs to be an update. We could force it to update, but it's not required, because anytime the user the user interacts with the authenticator, it's going to update. So if I just focus the username, you'll see that it updates and comes back down. If we take a look at the actual DOM element, if we go ahead and put our overflow hidden on here again, send it, comes down, we see 1 minute, goes back up. So now it's sitting with that message that is not the default message. But if we hit the send button, by the time it comes back down, we never see it other than the default message. So there's no reason to force an update. So let's go back to Visual Studio here. So like I said, this is sort of an abrupt change, which I do not like. So what we're going to do is animate that just a little bit. And to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is come up here and create another timing. So private read only, and I called it message animation timing. I'm going to change that to message timing, because of course it's an animation timing, and it's animation effect timing. And we're going to set the duration to be 250 milliseconds. The easing, we'll use ease in, out, and fill will be forwards. Perfect. Of course, to be able to animate something, we're going to need the DOM element itself, right? So we'll come down here, below this, we'll put a private message DOM. It's an HTML element. Null for now. And if we go down, let's set it while I'm thinking about it. So let's go to the after view init method. We'll say this dot message DOM is equal to this DOM reader dot find child by ID. Oh, forgot to set the ID, but this dot send screen DOM, and I'm going to call it this dot message ID. And let's do that now. Crazy thing here. Message ID. I don't know why I did this. Save a little bit of space here. There's no reason for these separate lines. So we're just returning that message ID. Great. And the way that we're going to actually do the animation is we could create another method and say, animate this. But we're just going to do that in a public set message. So we'll use a setter. We'll have to pass in a message, of course. So inside the setter, what we're going to do is say const out this.message DOM.animate. We're just going to animate the opacity. So we'll go from 1 to 0. And that's the message timing. So we have the out. So out.onFinish. So once it's finished, all we'll do is then we'll set the message field equal to the message being passed in. And of course, we need to animate it back in. So this dot message DOM.animate. Again, the opacity goes from 0 to 1. We want this dot message timing. Done, done, and done. So let us browse the notes real quick, and okay, save it. Come back to the browser, make sure it's updated. It has not, does not, because I forgot to set the ID on the template. And let's go back into the template here and give our square brackets attribute ID. And out we called it message ID. Save that. Go back to the browser. back to working. We hit the send button, and something happened because I'm also an idiot. So let's go back to the send screen. What's happening here, of course, is what I did inside the failure was to set the field. We need to remove that underscore so that we set the use the setter so that it'll run the animation. Third time's the charm. Click the button. It kind of blinked there, didn't update, until the very end, and it runs the animation, but Angular doesn't update the message there. The problem, of course, is that we need to force it to run an update so that it knows that there was a change to that message field. We've seen this before as well. We're going to come back up here and import the change detector ref from Angular core. Come down to our constructor. Create a private read-only. Maybe change detector ref. Change detector ref. I'm going to format this a little bit so we can read them once again. All right. So now that we have that, we're going to come up here and say this dot change detector ref dot detect changes. So after we've updated the message field, save that, back to the browser, send, and now we have it. Nice little fade out, fade in animation to tell the user, to update the message to the user. All right, so back to the browser, or back to Visual Studio again. It's time to do our first SVG. So I'm going to go back to the sendscreen.component.pug file, and I'm just going to copy this in. Imagine trying to type all of these numbers in. So what we have here is an SVG. That SVG contains two elements currently, one a path, one a line. And if I save that, we can go back to the browser, go to the elements here, scroll down to our send screen, go to the SVG. So we have a path. If I give that a stroke of, say, red, you'll see that that's the path. And we'll go to the line, give it a stroke of red. And so this is the SVG that we're animating, or we're about to animate. So what we're going to basically do is draw the first one here, and then once that's done, we'll animate in the line itself. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and let's see, what do we want to do? So like I said, we're going to animate, so this time we're not going to forget. We're going to go ahead and put our IDs in here now. Attribute.id. So xmark main ID, could have called it xmark path and line, but I didn't. Attribute.id, that equals xmark supplemental and ID. So we have the IDs. We're going to go back to the sendscreen.component.ts file. There's several changes that we're going to do in here, so I'm just going to go top to bottom so I don't forget, or attempt not to forget them. What I need to come in here is, so we're animating, and what we're animating basically is what the SVG has this dash offset, something else, dash array offset. And to do this, we need to know the length of the SVG, so the length of the path and the length of the line. So I'm going to create private underscore path length, and I called it path length xmark main. It's going to be a number, equals null to start with, private path length xmark sup, also a number, starts null. And we also need to have the access to the DOM elements, so we'll private underscore xmark main DOM. It's going to be an SVG path element, null, and private xmark sup DOM SVG line element. All right, so now I'm going to have, we're going to take, so the reason I'm doing the path length underscore and we're setting it to null here is we're going to do the whole lazy accessing of it. hopefully every time, or most of the time the user interacts with our authenticator, they're logging in successfully, or they're registering successfully, and they'll never see the error screen. So what we're going to do is create private get path length xmark main. We've seen this several times before. We'll say if this dot and underscore path length main. If that's not equal to null, then we'll just return it. Main. If it is, scroll this up. This dot path length xmark main is going to be equal to, we'll have to create this method here in a little bit. Calculate calculate path length, and we're also going to need to specify this here, xmark main dom, and then we'll just say return this dot path length xmark main. Okay. So we need to do that for the supplemental as well. So instead of doing that by hand, I'm going to copy it in here. Same deal. If the path length, the supplemental path length is already calculated, return it. Otherwise, calculate it using the supplemental DOM element. And what we'll do here is to find those elements. I'll type one in and talk about, or just copy the other one in. So get xmark main dom, and that's going to be if this dot xmark main dom not equal to null, then return this dot xmark main dom. Otherwise, this dot xmark main dom equals this dot dom reader dot find child by ID. Give it the send screen DOM and say look for the xmark, something else I haven't created yet, main ID. Okay, so the problem you'll see here is that our DOM reader is going to return an HTML element. We specified this to be an SVG path element. I briefly was going into the DOM reader to modify to say they might also return an SVG element. Not having the best of luck working out what the error was that's going on there. So we're going to cheat, at least for the moment, and just say any. And then we'll just return this dot xmark main dom. Right, and instead of typing the next one in, we're going to just paste it, and that's of course getting the xmark supplemental dom. And we need to put our IDs in here, so we'll come down here to the bottom of our public area, and so we have the xmark main ID and xmark supplemental ID, and that takes care of everything except for calculating it. Also, what I'm going to do is go to the ngViewInit method at the bottom of this. I'm going to put a couple of console log statements that will print out the path length properties. And now we're ready to add our private method. Private calculate, one day I'll type it right the first time, path length. We're going to pass in an SVG, which is an SVG element. And for now, we're just going to return, and I'm going to cast this as any for the moment. Get total length. Save that, go back to the browser, and go to the console log, and you'll say good old Chrome giving us these two numbers. Of course, this top number, 900 and some, is the path, and 191 is the line. And when I first did this, great. I motored on, I did the animation, and I was like, at one point I was like, hey, I wonder what this looks like in Firefox. So let's go to good old Firefox and see what we have. What we have here is we see the length of the path element, but then we get this error, svg.getTotalLength is not a function, and that's coming from the line. So I don't know whether this is just because SVG is updating to a new version. I think it's going to version 2, and there's different implementations in the browsers, or it's a Firefox thing. Don't really care. Seems to be a stupid thing that at one point there was a get total length. It did work at one point for a line, and now it doesn't. So we can't do it. Complaining doesn't help us, I guess. What we'll do is fix this. So let me start by fixing this by importing the low-is-nil function that we've seen previously. Because what I'm going to do is to say that, just copy this. What I'll do is say that if low-dash is nil, and if that total length function, if that is equal to false, then all we're going to do is return this thing. I don't know whether there is other SVG elements that are supposed to have this get total length element to it. I'm not an SVG expert, so what we're going to do is we could just assume that it is that all we'll ever care about is either a path or a line, but I'm going to create a switch, and we're going to switch on the tag name. So we'll have a case in which the tag name is equal to line, which is of course the one we want, and we'll just create the default real quick. If it's not a line, I'll just throw an error to tell myself that I need to do some work for something else. And luckily, one of the degrees I have is in mathematics, so that I'm able to do the complex math of calculating the length of a line. So what we have here, of course, like I said, is the line is an SVG line element. I could cast it to another variable up here and not have to deal with it each time. But so a line element has an x1 property, which has a base value, which has a value, which is a number, x2, y2, y1. And of course, to calculate the length of a line, do a little bit of math here, and we take the difference between the x values, square that, add it to the difference of the y values squared, and then take the square root. So now we have the length of the line. I'm going to save that, go back to the browser. You can see that Chrome is still giving us the numbers, and Firefox, if we scroll down to the bottom, is now also giving us the numbers that we want. Let's return back to Visual Studio, and while I'm thinking about it, let's get rid of our console statements here. And now we're ready to do some actual animating, I think. Maybe. One second. I feel like I've forgotten to do something. Maybe not. All right, well, let's continue here. So what I want to do is to modify the failure method. And inside that failure method, we're going to create a const main duration of equal to 1500. So the main duration obviously is animating the main part of the SVG, so the path. We're also going to create a little local function here called animate. We'll pass in an element, which is going to be an SVG element. We'll pass in its length, it's a number, and duration as a number. All right, so inside of here, what we're going to do is say element, and we're going to set the style dot stroke dash array. It's supposed to be a string here, so we'll just interpolate on the length. I'm going to copy that line because we want stroke dash offset to be set to it as well. And element dot style dot stroke, and that's going to be equal to red. Perfect. And the last thing that we're going to do inside of here is return. And what we're returning is element dot animate. We're going to animate the stroke dash, oops, no, capital offset. And we'll go from length to 0. And we need to do that in the duration provided to us. We're going to say, scroll down here, the easing to be linear, and fill to be forwards. All right, so we've gotten that done. Now we're able to say const main animation is equal to animate. We want to animate this dot xmark main DOM. Length is path length, xmark main, and main duration. Once that animation is complete, so on finish, we want to animate the const sup animation, animate this dot xmark sup DOM, this dot path length supplemental, and we have to do a little thinking about it here for a second. The duration that I want is main duration, but I want it to be proportional to the length of this dot path length sup divided by this dot path length main, so that it has the same, proportionally the same duration as the main animation. Once the sup animation, okay, don't help me, dot on finish, once it's done, all I want to do is, for the moment, we're going to copy this set timeout up here. We'll have a timer that runs an element that shows the thing is about to hide, and we'll do that probably in the next video. But I also want to do is to specify an on finish function method. And so it's going to take in nothing and do void, and we're going to go ahead and make it optional. And so if there is an on finish function passed in, so low dash is nil is false, then we'll run it.